Well, we're at your election headquarters, and it is an election night that will go down in the history books in DeSoto County. The Mississippi special election yesterday wasn't just another vote. It was the first time voters cast ballots in a newly created majority black Senate district ordered by a federal court. WRG's Alex Coleman talked with one of the winners who made history.
The Supreme Court's ruling to effectively weaken the effects test of the Voting Rights Act has triggered alarm across the political spectrum, and the immediate consequences are already starting to emerge. The first and most noticeable indication of what lies ahead can be seen in Republican-led southern states, where lawmakers are already taking steps to reshape congressional districts represented by Black Americans. In Mississippi, Governor Tate Reeves has already proposed eliminating the state's only majority Black House district, which is striking given that Mississippi has one of the largest Black populations in the country. Analysts and observers who closely track voting rights issues anticipate similar actions unfolding in other southern states in the coming days and weeks.
DeSoto County, Mississippi, the votes have been counted. For Democrat Teresa Gillespie Isom, her decisive Senate victory was personal and historic.
Yes, it was history being made. First African-American senator, as well as the first female senator in DeSoto County. So it was history.
This election followed court-ordered redistricting.
This is not a minor procedural dispute. It is a deliberate and calculated political maneuver with deep historical roots, and understanding that history is key to grasping the full significance of what is happening now. To understand the seriousness of the situation, it helps to look back not centuries, but just a few decades. In 1970, Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi had no Black representatives in Congress at all. This was not because Black voters were absent in those states.
Voters in a newly created majority Black Mississippi Senate district made their voices heard, electing Isom, who captured 63% of the vote, over Republican Charlie Hoots's 37%.
It means that we have had the opportunity now to make sure that the people in DeSoto County have a voice that's a Democratic voice, not that all seats in DeSoto County are Republican.
In Mississippi alone, Black residents made up roughly 35% of the population. The lack of Black representation was not accidental. It was the predictable outcome of systemic voter suppression, discriminatory districting practices, and a political culture that for generations worked to ensure Black voices had little influence in government. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to shift that reality, but it was the 1982 amendments that truly reshaped the legal framework.
If you live in one of the handful of districts in the state that had legislative races Tuesday, you may not have realized the domino effect of the results.
Republicans have held a supermajority in both the House and Senate the last 13 years. Tuesday's special election results break that cycle. Democrats gained 2 seats in the Senate, bringing the Republican total down to 34. That's 1 fewer than what's needed for a supermajority. The Republicans remain in control, but it will require more bipartisan efforts to pass certain measures that require a 2/3 vote.
Those amendments introduced what is known as the effects test, allowing courts and advocates to challenge voting practices not only when there was clear evidence of racist intent, but also when those practices produced discriminatory outcomes regardless of intent. The reasoning behind this change was straightforward. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Southern jurisdictions had become adept at working around the system.
Mississippi Senate Democrats celebrated their efforts to gain 2 more seats.
The momentum that you saw last night was about the power that we have in representing our communities.
According to data from Senator David Blunt, Teresa Isom flipped the seat in District 2 with 63% of the vote.
Had grown sophisticated enough to avoid explicitly racist language in their policies. Instead, they achieved the same discriminatory results through seemingly neutral mechanisms, at-large voting systems, strategic annexations, and district maps that packed or split Black communities to weaken their political power. The effects test was designed to address this kind of subtle discrimination by focusing on outcomes rather than intent. The 1982 amendments passed with bipartisan support in Congress. They were not considered radical by most Americans.
Democrats are celebrating the momentum while Republicans are downplaying its overall impact.
I believe we're going to have close votes on several measures, and certainly when we come to money bills, those bills that require 3/5 votes. and suspension resolutions or constitutional amendments that require 2/3 votes. The victory that we achieved last night and the momentum we actually are expressing today will be critical.
While you may not have a supermajority, you just expect to do super work. So I think if we have good policies, good positions, we have bipartisan support for those, you don't have to worry about what the number is.
But they were controversial in certain legal and political circles. One of the most notable opponents at the time was a young lawyer in the Department of Justice. That lawyer was John Roberts, now the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Roberts played a key role in the Reagan administration.
The recent Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Calais effectively killed the last remaining provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was authored by Justice Samuel Alito, but it represents the life's work of Chief Justice John Roberts. The Roberts Court has now gutted the Voting Rights Act on 3 different occasions, and Roberts wrote or joined every one of those opinions.
Administration's effort to block the 1982 amendments. He wrote memos and argued that the changes represented what he described as a radical form of electoral engineering. He opposed them, but ultimately lost that battle, and the amendments became law. However, Roberts never abandoned his skepticism toward the effects test and the broader legal framework it represented. More than 4 decades later, the Supreme Court he now leads has effectively delivered what he and other like-minded conservatives had long pursued: the dismantling of the legal standard that made modern enforcement of the Voting Rights Act possible. The court has been careful in how it frames its decision. The justices have not explicitly stated that they are overturning the 1982 amendments. They will insist in their opinions and public remarks that the Voting Rights Act still exists. However, legal scholars and civil rights advocates widely agree that the ruling is functionally equivalent to gutting the law. By eliminating or severely limiting the effects test, the court has made it extremely difficult for plaintiffs to challenge discriminatory voting practices. Without the ability to prove discrimination through outcomes, advocates must now prove discriminatory intent, which is exactly the higher bar the 1982 amendments were designed to avoid. In effect, the court has turned back the legal landscape to the period before those reforms were enacted. Another aspect of the court's conduct deserves attention beyond policy implications, and that is the issue of judicial process and institutional integrity. The specific question the court ruled on was not even one actively disputed by the parties in the case. The justices raised it themselves, effectively seeking an opportunity to address an issue they had long wanted to revisit. This type of judicial activism is the same behavior conservative justices have historically criticized when attributed to liberal courts. The majority also disregarded its own recent precedents, including rulings issued just a few years earlier, in order to reach its preferred conclusion. The reasoning used to reconcile the current decision with those precedents has not been convincing to many legal observers across the ideological spectrum. This context is important for understanding how to respond to the court's current trajectory. When discussions about Supreme Court reform arise, they are often framed in purely partisan terms, as though objections stem only from ideological disagreement. But the case for reform goes beyond ideology. It is based on a pattern in which the current majority has overridden Congress, ignored precedent, and addressed issues not directly presented in cases to achieve specific outcomes. When Congress passes a law on a bipartisan basis, as it did with the 1982 Voting Rights Act amendments, it should expect that law to be respected. When courts instead reinterpret or reshape statutes they find inconvenient, it raises concerns that extend beyond any single policy decision. The real-world consequences will go far beyond congressional districts. The redistricting battles that follow this ruling will affect every level of government. City councils, county commissions, judicial elections, and school boards all rely on the same legal framework that has now been weakened. Every jurisdiction where district lines were drawn to ensure Black and Latino voters had a meaningful opportunity to elect representatives of their choice will now face a far more uncertain legal environment. Decades of progress toward more diverse and representative local governments could be undone if officials redraw maps without previous legal constraints. The same concerns apply to Latino communities, which have also depended on Voting Rights Act protections to secure representation at all levels of government. The Southwest, in particular, has a long history of Latino underrepresentation despite significant population shares. The legal tools that allowed challenges to that imbalance have now been significantly reduced, and affected communities will be watching closely to see how lawmakers respond to this more permissive environment. While the legal developments in Washington are significant, it is also useful to examine the broader political context. Reporting from Ohio provides insight into a country undergoing change in ways that challenge simple narratives about permanent Republican strength or inevitable Democratic decline. Ohio is a revealing case because of its political evolution. For decades, it was a classic swing state, often aligning with the winner of presidential elections. That shifted with Donald Trump. His coalition, built largely on working-class white voters in industrial and rural areas, turned Ohio into a reliably Republican state. Trump won comfortably in 2016 and 2020, and his margins increased further in 2024, carrying 81 of 88 counties. That level of dominance suggests a solidly red state. Yet as the 2026 midterms approach, Democrats believe Ohio could become competitive again, not just in congressional races, but in statewide contests. After years of Republican control, Democrats are seriously discussing a comeback. Such a shift requires persuasion, not just demographic change, and there is evidence that some former Trump voters are reconsidering. The Mahoning Valley in northeastern Ohio illustrates these dynamics. Once a Democratic stronghold rooted in manufacturing and labor unions, it shifted during the Trump era as his economic message resonated with voters affected by deindustrialization. Many of those voters supported Trump in hopes of economic revival. Local Democratic leaders now argue those expectations were not met. Visible enthusiasm for Trump, signs, flags, and merchandise has noticeably declined, suggesting a possible shift. Lordstown, Ohio is a particularly symbolic location. It was home to a major General Motors plant that supported thousands of union jobs. Trump promised to protect such jobs, urging workers to stay optimistic. When the plant closed in 2019, it undermined those promises. Subsequent developments, including a largely underutilized Foxconn facility and a troubled electric battery plant, have not fully replaced the lost economic base. Union workers note that new jobs lack the stability and benefits of previous union positions. Broader economic data supports this concern, showing declines in manufacturing employment since Trump's return to office. Individual stories highlight these trends. Some former Trump supporters now identify as independents or support Democrats, citing concerns about democratic institutions or foreign policy decisions. Economic issues also play a major role. Rising costs of living in many counties are outpacing wages, creating financial pressure across political lines. For Democrats, this presents an opportunity to focus on economic realities and persuade voters who previously supported Trump. However, the scale of Republican dominance means that winning requires significant shifts among voters. The connection between these political dynamics and voting rights is significant. Critics argue that efforts to weaken voting protections are partly a response to shifting political support. If persuasion becomes more difficult, changing the rules of participation becomes another strategy. The Voting Rights Act has long limited such approaches, and weakening it removes a key barrier. However, this strategy may have unintended consequences. The same protections that ensured minority representation also limited how Democrats could draw districts in states they control. If those constraints disappear, Democrats could potentially redraw maps to their advantage. Whether they will pursue such strategies remains a subject of debate within the party. There is a growing sentiment among Democrats that responding aggressively may be necessary if Republicans continue to exploit legal and procedural advantages. The political environment appears to be shifting, with more willingness to consider structural reforms and strategic responses. Whether this translates into electoral success remains uncertain. Midterm elections are complex, and public frustration does not always lead to voter turnout. What is clear is that the United States is engaged in a significant debate over democratic rules and representation. Voting rights, district boundaries, court authority, and political norms are all in flux. The Supreme Court's decision is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader struggle over the structure of American democracy and who has meaningful access to it. The outcome of this struggle will shape the country's political future for years to come.